Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
"2025 has been a very dark year for the United States. We've seen a lot of violence being done against our neighbors in the name of Jesus, even against our Christian neighbors. It's gotten so dark that we now have conservative leaders saying that our government leaders are guilty of war crimes and murder. So if even those who back the Trump administration are saying these things, imagine the dread the rest of us feel. And on top of all this darkness, there's still the matter of the Epstein files. As the darkness looms over us, many of us are wondering when we'll get some kind of relief. In a piece titled Upside Down Advent, Despair versus Hope, B&G Executive Director Marc wrote, quote, "I despair for the future of our nation and the Christian church because so many evangelicals have thrown out what we once thought were inherent moral or objective truths. None of that seems to matter to them anymore. And when the rest of us protest, we're called crazy or deranged. The very ideals we were brought up in the church believing mattered most now do not matter at all. Tearing apart families is okay. Telling lie after lie after lie is okay. Having extramarital affairs is okay. Cheating at business deals is okay. Calling people names is okay. Seeking revenge is okay. Taking food and medicine from other people is okay. Arresting innocent people is okay. Threatening to execute elected officials you don't like is okay. Slaughtering people who are suspected of crimes but neither arrested nor investigated is okay. All these things are real today. All these things happened this very week. And the evangelical church is okay with it all." Unquote. Wingfield's piece is the first of a 4-part series on Advent that you can read at baptistnews.com. As he and many Christians like him ponder the season of Advent in light of what we're reading or listening to on the news each day, questions begin to arise like, is there hope? Is there a dawn? Or is this it? What might that dawn look like? And how could we begin planting seeds of it today? So I sat down for a conversation with another Marc, Pastor Marc Schelske. He's the pastor of Bridge City Community Church in Milwaukie, Oregon. He's also a writer and has recently posted a PDF he put together for his church community about the Advent prophecy candle of hope. I wanted to hear his thoughts on how the season of Advent may help us process the darkness surrounding us in the news today. So here's my conversation with Pastor Marc Schelske. A lot of us who grew up in conservative evangelicalism, but then moved toward a more progressive expression of Christianity, tend to gravitate toward liturgy. And I know in my experience, a lot of mainline congregations, like liturgy and the liturgical calendar play a far bigger role than they ever did in the more conservative complementarian community type churches I was a part of. So why do you think liturgy resonates with those of us who would be considered more progressive so much, especially when so much of liturgy is rooted in tradition?
Well, I think that is actually the exact reason. I think most Christians that I've interacted with who have moved from an evangelical or evangelical adjacent form of Christianity towards something that's either more mainline or more progressive, I think one of the key things that fuels that is that the churches many of us were raised in have a very short history. They are churches that either came to be, in the U.S. in the late 1800s, or they're independent churches whose history is 2 generations old, and when we were taught the Bible or when we were taught theology, many of us, this will be a caricature, but it's accurate to the conversations I've had. Many of us were taught a church history that basically there was Jesus, then there were the apostles who faithfully passed on what Jesus taught. Then there was almost 1,800 years of chaos and lies. And then there's our church. And what you hear in our church from the pulpit is basically what Paul taught. Like, it's the same thing. We're just contextualizing it with modern words, but there's no change. And I think many of us that, deconstructed from that model did so precisely because we encountered church history. We came to understand the long theological conversation that has been happening for 2,000 years, to see some of the errors the church made in the past and how the church responded to that, and some of the errors the church made in the past and never dealt with. And so having that sense of rootedness, I think is really powerful and important. And so I think many of us are drawn to that. And participating in the elements of liturgical church, so the church calendar and the lectionary and those elements, I think is a way for us to tie back to a heritage that extends beyond the churches that were born in America, extends beyond the churches that were a part of the whole colonialized history of Christianity, and goes back to the beginning, not in the sense that we can perfectly replicate the early church and everything the early church did was perfect, not that, but in the sense of having a deep rootedness in a heritage that has a long discussion that goes way back beyond, just this Sunday your pastor said, I'm telling you what Paul said.
Yeah, I know, like for me, there's also not only that rootedness, but a relatedness that I tend to resonate with in a lot of like modern spirituality talks, of like how like we're all related as a human race, or even like the entire universe, like humans, animals, plants, the earth,
Mhm.
like it's all related. And some of that can get kind of like, it can feel a little progressive woo-woo, in
Sure.
a lot of today's conversations. But then when you look at like Meister Eckhart or Saint Francis of Assisi, and these are
Yes.
people that are like 700-800 years ago talking about, in the Canticle of the Creatures, like the
Right.
whole universe is a family. Like you start to realize, oh wait, like no, I'm not just being swept up by the Democrats and modern
Right.
woo-woo stuff. Like this is
Right.
actually has a
Yeah, that's
history to
exactly
it.
right. Yeah, you can read Gregory the Great writing in the 6th century about how wealthy people who don't do their share to take care of the poor are actually stealing from them. Right, that's a Catholic pope in the 6th century writing those words. Right, you can go back to the Cappadocian Fathers at the end of the 4th century, and they're talking about union with the divine in a way that many evangelical churches today would think, oh my gosh, that's New Age, but they were rooting it right in the Gospel of John, and I think these are things that many of us, people like me who grew up in evangelical adjacent Christianity, never heard any of that. And we're told that the kind of Christianity we were offered, and that includes the whole narrative with things like atonement theology and, what happens after you die and what's our relationship and posture towards other people in the world who aren't Christians, all of that, we were told this is what Christianity is. And the second that you fall into the footnotes and start reading ancient Christianity, you discover that that is patently not true, and that there's been an ongoing discussion for a long time. And that discussion has borne fruit in things like the liturgical cycle and the feasts and the fasts of the church year and the lectionary, which tie us to this central narrative. Here is who Jesus was, he taught, he did these things, he lived, he died, and then here's how the church responded to that. And because you didn't get it the first time, now it's the beginning of Advent, we're going to do it again. And then, you get to the end of the church year, and because you didn't get it the first time, we get to the beginning of Advent and we do it again. And there's this cycle walking through the story of Jesus and the response of the church over and over and over again. And that to me has proven to be so much more profoundly deep than the like 6-week topical sermon series that I grew up under, where we're gonna, oh, what's the Bible's wisdom for how to handle your finances? 6 weeks, boom. What's the Bible's wisdom for Christian marriages? 6 weeks, boom. Right? That kind of stuff isn't in the church calendar, right? The church
Yeah.
calendar is Jesus came, he lived, he taught, he died, he rose again, and the church responded to that. And we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again. And Jesus' plan for you applying that to your whole life is the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, that makes sense. So speaking of Advent, you recently shared a PDF on social media about the prophecy candle of hope. And you wrote, quote, "Now and in times past, nations could only imagine violence as the way to bring peace. Rabid greed and lust for power always breed injustice. Those with the power to make changes rarely seem motivated to help. Facing all of this, our hearts can grow tired, cynical, or numb," unquote. And I'm especially interested in that limited imagination because
Mm,
it seems like a lot of the conversations we're having today are due to Christians having an imagination where justice is limited to retribution and
yes.
relationship is limited to hierarchical power. So, like, how do you see Christian theologies of justice and power sacralizing empire rather than subverting it? And what do we do with that tiredness and cynicism and numbness that we so often feel when we're inundated with all of that?
Wow. That is a big, rich, deep question. Um, I think the primary reason for the numbness is that emotional response that we all get as humans where we feel like we can't make a difference, right? The problems are too big for us. And when it comes to things in these categories of justice, many of us were taught that righteousness is primarily an individual interest, right? God is interested in how righteous and holy of a person you are. Jesus died to pay the price of atonement for your sins so that you can go to heaven. And that can feel sort of manageable on a certain scale. The implication of that teaching was that if every individual human would just be, holy, then we wouldn't have these larger problems. If every individual Christian would, confess their sins and let the Holy Spirit transform them, we wouldn't have racism. And there's a way in which that's true, right? If every Christian was regenerated and filled with the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit were filling their lives, then we wouldn't have those kinds of things. But what we didn't ever talk about in those conversations was how individual humans historically have been quite good at delegating, offloading, outsourcing their morality to systems. And as soon as something becomes a policy or a law or a standard procedure, it's not my responsibility anymore, right? And so you go from, say, individual Christians who are racist saying, I don't want black people to live in my neighborhood. So that's a personal moral issue. And if their heart was changed and they didn't feel that way, wouldn't that be wonderful? But somewhere along the way, people who felt that way wrote policies, and those policies became redlining, and banks began to only give out mortgages to white people in certain neighborhoods. Now, who's responsible for that? It's just a policy, right? The guy at the bank sitting at the desk who signs off on the mortgage, he's not necessarily, he doesn't feel like he's making a personal moral choice. He's just following the policy of the bank, right? It's not his fault. And so what has happened is that the personal, accountable, moral responsibility has been outsourced to a system, and systems cannot be held accountable. Do systems go to heaven? Are systems judged before God? I would say they are judged before God, but in that mindset that I was raised with, there's no accountability for them. And because there's no accountability for systems, and I'm not really making decisions anymore, I'm just following policy, I'm not responsible either. So now no one's responsible. And we look at the world around us, and that's what we have, right? We have cheap clothes that are cheap because of slavery. And we don't like that reality. But I'm not at fault. I'm not personally an owner of a sweatshop in Indonesia. So I'm not the one making the moral choice. So, now I have to make ends meet in this economy. I don't have enough money. So of course I'm going to go shop at that store to get t-shirts for my kids. And I'm not ethically, morally responsible for the fact that the reason it's cheap is because of slavery, right? And so the moral quality has been offloaded entirely to systems. And I think that creates this very strange tension for us where how do you do right when systems can't be held accountable? And if you feel like there's nothing that I can do, I can't change the economic system. My family are not going to be able to change the economic system. but then you still feel in your heart that there's wrong being done and you can't do anything about it, that leads to numbness, that leads to cynicism, that leads
Mhm.
to a lack of hope.
Yeah. And I notice like the more I get into reading about like the darkness, the systemic darkness around us, like it can be hard for me to talk about words like hope or hope for a dawn, especially in
Hmm.
times of like Advent as well,
Yeah.
because how do we hold on to hope while also remaining present where we're at in the darkness?
Yeah.
And also like I struggle with talking about it in the presence of marginalized communities
Sure.
because it almost feels like I'm being overly positive in a way
Sure.
that's not naming what they're dealing with today.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's one of the reasons why Advent is so special to me. And I think why I see such wisdom in the liturgical cycle, right? In the modern era, in the US in particular, Advent sort of gets treated by many people as, 4 weeks of pre-gaming Christmas. Like it's 4 extra weeks for Christmas decorations and Christmas music and that festival feeling that we love. And that is not what Advent is, right? Advent is a fast. In the ancient Christian calendar, we have a cycle of fasts and feasts. That you have a fast where you prepare your heart for something, and then you have a feast. So most famous of those is, of course, Lent, leading into Pascha, into the Easter season, right? And so Lent is this season of introspection, reflection on my own internal reality, and then coming into Easter where we celebrate the risen Christ and transformation, right? Well, Advent is the same. Advent is a fast leading to Christmastide. And what is the fast about? Well, fast is always about spiritual preparation, and spiritual preparation is always about confronting the truth. And so Advent is not 4 bonus weeks of Christmas. Advent is the liminal space of living in the darkness. Christmas is saying the light has come. Advent is the season before the light has come, where we are in the tension of wanting the light and seeing the darkness. Right. And so, for instance, this past Sunday, the lectionary passage that we followed for church was Isaiah 2, 1-5. And so here's this wonderful passage that Christians have read as prophecy. Right. So the nations are going to stream to the mountain of the Lord. They're going to learn the Lord's ways. They're going to beat their swords into plowshares. Isn't that wonderful? And Christians have read that as this prophecy of a time of peace. And here's the tension, if we are willing to look at it. In the original register, when Isaiah wrote those words to people in Jerusalem and said, this is a thing the Lord is going to do, the reality is that never happened for those people. Never. It never happened. And if we expand that over the historical record, there is no point in time in Israel's history where that happened for Israel. And if we begin to look at the way that Christians began to use that passage, there is no time in church history where that reality has happened, right? And so what we will do to kind of avoid that discomfort is we will take that passage and project it into eschatology. This is something that's going to happen when Jesus comes back. This is something that's going to happen at the end, or this is something that happens in heaven. It's describing heaven. Well, it isn't describing heaven, because in the passage, they're beating swords into plowshares, which means they're taking weapons of war, which they needed, and they're making engines of farming. Well, there's not going to be farming in heaven, right? Why would they do that? Well, because the vision is this is a world where all the energy that we take and use in defensiveness, in protecting people from marginalization, in defending our own egos, all that energy is no longer needed. And we can put it into the work of providing for people. Right?
Hmm.
So that's what the passage is talking about. If we take that and plug that into the future when Jesus comes, then we don't have to think about the fact that we live in a world right now where we are choosing to take the resources and energy that could be providing for people, and instead we are using that energy and resources to make weapons of war, right? Instead of taking the swords and beating them into plowshares, we are taking the plowshares and beating them into swords. That's the reality of this moment. And Advent asks us to face that, right? And in my little church service, in our little community, we're not going to solve that problem, but we are going to stand together and name it and say, we live in a world that is filled with people who are more concerned about their own self-interest and defending their ego and defending their position and defending the artificial lines of nation and ethnicity so that they can feel better or secure or safe or somehow validated, that they'd rather do that than make sure people are taken care of.
Yeah.
And they don't recognize that the reason there's a cause to feel unsafe in the world is because people aren't taken care of. Right. These facts are related. And so Advent invites us to stand in that tension. Right. And so in the room of our gathering, there are people who have enough. There are a few people who have extra, and there are many people who don't have enough in the room while we're reading this, while we're talking about this. Right. And if we name that tension rather than pushing it off to the future and say, oh, everybody just know it'll all be good when Jesus comes. Okay, fine. How does that help? Right? It doesn't. It doesn't help, except for maybe, some sort of hope and endurance that, okay, I can continue to put up with this horrible situation. But by naming that tension, we're living in the truth. That is the reality. And that is why when Christmas comes and we celebrate that the light has come and that God has come to be among us and to walk in the darkness of our human experience with us, we are not alone. That celebration is going to be so meaningful because we have stood in this liminal space of facing the darkness. And that's what Advent is for. And I find that is absolutely brilliant, right? It's giving us a chance to not live in denial. It's giving us a chance to not spiritually bypass the things about life that are uncomfortable, to name them, to do what we can to support one another, and then to have this experience of connection to the truth so that when we celebrate that the light has come, there's reason to celebrate it.
Yeah, because you can't actively heal what you're not aware of, and Advent gives you a chance to grow your awareness by naming what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. So you think of both of these, the major feasts of Christmas and Easter. Those feasts can become flat and procedural and lose their transformative power if we only are coming to them without naming these realities, right? So Advent says, let's look at the darkness in the world around us. Lent says, let's look at the darkness within us, right? And so then we come to those feasts going, yep, the world is messed up. Yep, it's dark. We really do need the light. We really do need the angels to sing, peace and goodwill to all humankind. We really do need that. If we just take Advent as an opportunity to have 4 more weeks of Christmas carols and decorations, we're ignoring all of that. And we take the power of what we are supposed to be remembering at Christmas and we diffuse it.
Yeah. So you talk about Jesus coming not with the sword, but with self-giving love, who invites us to live not from fear, but from compassion, who asks us to resist circling the wagons for personal safety, but rather to expand our circle of care for the good of the world. I wonder if you could speak some to the way moving from fear to compassion helps us lay down our swords and expand our circle, and what exactly does expanding our circle mean?
Yeah. But that's a great question. I think that there's this fundamental human problem that, when you're born, because of the way that it works, being born and coming to consciousness and beginning to have a perception of the world around you, most of us are born and we have parents immediately there caretaking for us. Because of that, your consciousness develops with this idea that you're the center of the universe. Like, that's normal. I kind of think of this as how I really reconcile the idea of original sin. I don't believe that there's a sin that's passed down through, sex or, that you are responsible for what Adam did. I don't believe that that's an accurate reading of Scripture, but I do think there's something about being human that pushes us into this place. And I think the way that I put it together is this, that like every single human that's ever been born has been born with the perception that they're the center of the universe. Which is true when you're an infant, right? You cry, and if you have good caretakers, your cry is met with food, or your cry is met with affection, or your cry is met with someone changing your diaper, right? That's what happens. And you learn the way the brain works, you learn from experience. And so you learn my needs are met. The universe exists to take care of my needs. So that's where we all start as infants. The process of maturing, both as a human and spiritually, which I don't think of as two separate things, the process of maturing is coming to realize over time that you are not, in fact, the center of the universe, that there are other people and that those people have feelings and thoughts and hopes and dreams. And, at first, that's your parents. You begin to learn that they are real people, and maybe then siblings, and then maybe schoolmates, and then maybe the people on your block. And somewhere out here, a lot of people get stuck in that expanding circle of maturing. And the stuckness means they don't cross over the line where they come to think that people who live in other countries are also a part of the circle, or people that have different skin color are also a part of this circle, or people that have different worldviews and religions are also a part of this circle, right? So the maturing process is that circle of who is cared for expands. And I think in Revelation, we have this picture, right, of kind of the culmination of Revelation when all of the nations gather around the throne. And there's this incredible diversity of tongue, tribe, and nation, everyone worshiping the king gathered around the throne. That is the ultimate end of this trajectory, that everyone is included. And the spiritual journey is that development. And I think that what Jesus does in the New Testament and how the early church responds to what Jesus does helps broaden this circle, right? Jesus is broadening the circle constantly in who he's talking to, and who he heals, and who he shows respect for. Jesus broadens the circle. And then the early church wrestles with that same thing, And so Philip has this conversation with the Ethiopian eunuch. That guy is a foreigner. He's a different skin color. He's a gender minority because he's a eunuch. And Philip has this moment where he can decide, do I follow Torah that says no eunuch is welcome in the house of the Lord? Or do I follow Isaiah that says every eunuch is welcome in the house of the Lord? What do I do, right? And Philip, following the Spirit, and, teaches the eunuch, baptizes the eunuch, sends the eunuch back to Africa as the first Christian, first missionary to Africa, right? So expanding the circle. And we see this over and over and over and over. And so that's the goal. That's where the gospel is taking us, but we get stuck, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that process of expanding the circle is really about compassion and empathy, right? When you as a tiny kid cross that line of realizing your parents have feelings, that is empathy changing your consciousness. And then later on, you have that same experience with other people. And at first it's your peers at school and maybe your neighbors, and maybe you've got one family on the block who isn't like you in some way. They're a different color, or they're from a different country, or they have a different religion, and you get to know them and you feel compassion for them and you begin to understand their story, and the circle expands, right? And that is the process that God's designed for human consciousness and relationship. And as we learn people's stories and have compassion for them, we have less need for that self-defensiveness toward them. And when we get stuck along that path, we stay in that need for self-defensiveness, and that results in all of the tension and conflict that we see in the world around us.
Yeah. A lot of this feels to me like a question would be like, what future is being planted right now? Because like you talk about, you say God's future of peace is already breaking into the present. And it's interesting when you get into Revelation and you get into the apocalypse and end times, because a lot of us tend to associate apocalypse with words like disaster or tribulation or violence, right, or the blood flowing to the horse's bridle.
Right.
And yet, like Ephesians 1 talks about an apocalypse of union. And which to me would seem to be something worth hoping for and getting excited about, not being terrified by. And so
Yes.
like how do you think of apocalypse? How does that play into this practice of Advent for you, and how might that help us as we're processing like the news as we watch that seems to show how everything is so dark around us today?
Yeah, the word apocalypse is a funny one because in popular language, it definitely means a cataclysmic sort of world-ending situation, battle, war, something like that. And I understand how the word came to carry those connotations. But that's not what the word means when the book at the end of the New Testament, its Greek name is the Apocalypse. When it was named the Apocalypse, that word didn't mean a cataclysmic world ending event. Apocalypse means the revealing, right? The uncovering. That's what it means. It means that you are seeing the truth of something. So I think seeing the truth of something is good. I think it's important. I'm 4 years now out from having surgery to remove stage 3 melanoma from my back. We found it. It was growing right in the middle of my back. I would never have seen it. My family went on a trip. We were swimming. My wife saw this strange growth on my back, which I would never have seen. I wouldn't have been able to touch it. It was right where I couldn't reach. So I went to the doctor, and in short order, the doctor saw it, said, "Oh gosh, you're seeing a dermatologist." The dermatologist saw it and said, "Oh gosh, you're going to the night cancer center. Right, this needs to be dealt with right away." And so that's terrifying. And we go, have the biopsies and the screenings and all of the imagery and all that. And I'm sitting in the office with this guy, Dr. Veto, who's a melanoma specialist here in Oregon. And he walks in and he's going to tell me what's up. So this is a terrifying moment, right? This doctor is going to come in and tell me about the cancer that I have and what it means and what its implications are. That is an apocalypse, right? Because in that moment, my life is changing. I mean, it's already changed. I already have the cancer, but now I'm going to learn, what does this mean for me, right? And he comes in and he's very serious about it. He's like, we're, micrometers away from this being staged as stage 3. It's very rapid, but it's in this one place. It doesn't seem to be in the lymph node. So we're going to remove it surgically. And here's the things we're going to do. And we're going to do this right away. And 4 weeks later, I was in surgery, and surgery is violent, right? They're cutting into my body. I have an 8-inch scar on my back. They removed this whole section of skin. They removed lymph nodes, and recovery is painful. So that's all apocalyptic, right? That is a scene of judgment, that this person who has the information comes into this room and changes the shape of my life by telling me the truth. They say, you have this in your body. It is going to kill you. It has to come out. Are you willing to undergo the necessary painful steps to have it removed? That's a moment of judgment, right? And it's not judgment that is punitive, even though I'm going to go through pain, even though I'm going to go through this violent experience. It is not punitive. It is not punishment. It is not arbitrary. It is medicinal. It is for my good. And that moment of revelation, that is what apocalypse is, right? That is the biblical concept. You are going to see the truth, whether it's the truth about you or the truth about your country. We've had an apocalypse these last 8 years that has revealed the truth about our country to many of us, that because of our position in society or our privilege or the color of our skin, didn't realize the depths of the rot in our country. We have seen it now. We've had an apocalypse. And the result of apocalypse is an opportunity for life change, right? That's how it has always been, right? The Hebrew prophets were not Nostradamus prophets. They were ethical preachers. So the passage that we studied this last week in Isaiah, when we get to the end of this vision, the nations will stream to the mountain of the Lord. They'll beat their swords into plowshares. The end of that, the very last line is, "Come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." So Isaiah is not saying, hey guys, this is something God is going to do in the distant future. Just be grateful and thankful and take a deep breath because God is going to solve all our problems. That is not what he says. He paints this picture, this vision of how the world could be. And then he says, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. That is an ethical invitation. Mm-hmm. Let us start living this way. Let us start caring for our neighbor in this way. That is how it's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I know this can be a lot to process for people, and we talk to a lot of journalists and historians and scholars, but I think it's also important to hear from pastors because, pastors are helping people walk through a lot of this spiritually, and there's a lot of people who are nervous to talk to pastors. So I appreciate you
Yes.
coming on and sharing your thoughts with us.
Absolutely. And if you were to sit with me in a coffee shop, it wouldn't be this intense. I promise I would do a lot more listening.
Yeah, no, you're good. Thanks.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.